Once again, we welcome you to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to welcome Samantha Dagres back to the program. She is a regular on this show. But for those meeting you for the first time, Samantha, take a moment. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm glad to be back, Brian. So, as you said, my name is Samantha Dagres. I am currently communications manager at a Montreal-based think tank called the Montreal Economic Institute. We cover provincial and federal public policy in Canada, and I'm also a Young Voices contributor.
Seems like last time we talked, there was a fairly weighty election getting ready to take place in Canada. Can you tell me about the outcome of that election?
Oh, yes. Oh, was there? Yeah. So
that's tongue in cheek. For those who don't know, we had quite a conversation on that.
Yeah. So we are coming off of a federal election that was called by Justin Trudeau. He had to step down. And I mean, to fast forward, the leader of the party became a gentleman named Mark Carney, who was kind of a lifelong bureaucrat. He was governor of the Bank of Canada, the Bank of England, and decided to throw his, hat in the ring politically. And so, people say that Pierre Poilievre would have won the election had it been called in 2024 on issues that were top of mind before Donald Trump waged up a tariff war on us. He was really coming out on top. I think the most he had at some point was a 25-point lead. So really, we thought we were going to have a majority conservative government. Trump enters the group chat and he decides that he is going to, basically reverse a lot of the free trade that Canada and the United States benefited from. Canadians wanted a tough on Trump candidate, and they got one in Mark Carney. So I would say that's the TLDR of why we have another Liberal government in Ottawa.
Okay. And, I thought about you as I saw the results of the election being announced. I was like, wow, this will be an interesting conversation, and here we are. But today we're going to talk specifically about taxes and tax cuts. I think you and I have talked actually a couple of times about the plight of the taxpayer in Canada right now. You've communicated quite well that taxpayers are feeling stretched pretty thin.
Yeah, as you said, I've kind of taken it on as my personal beat to talk about the tax burden in Canada. And basically what I wanted to do just ahead of the election was kind of rework the spin that was adopted when it came to discussions on tax cuts. So all federal parties at the time proposed income tax relief for the middle class. The Liberals proposed a more modest income tax cut. So the lowest bracket would go down from 15 to 14. The Conservatives wanted to drop that down to 12.75. So there was consensus amongst the parties that Canada, the tax burden faced by Canadians was very, very heavy. But at the end of the day, it's still very modest. The Liberals calculated that this would basically come out to $400 per person a year, which is not nothing. But what I thought was interesting was that when discussing it, journalists and pundits would talk about the cost to government, the cost of tax cuts. And I wanted to really, push back on that because, it's your money. The government doesn't have, first dibs. I mean, that's kind of how it feels now, but first dibs on your income, on your paychecks, right? So they're not losing revenue, rather they're taking less of what wasn't theirs to begin with.
I appreciate that explanation. I say that as a taxpayer in another country, and I appreciate you making that distinction because there's an entitlement mindset that many politicians hold. And so, letting me keep more of my money in my pocket, that's going to cost somebody something. Well, no, it's my money in the first place.
No, absolutely. And it was, I think because we've normalized, I mean, more so in Canada, but also in the United States, such high tax burdens that we see it as, the government is doing us a favor and letting us keep our hard-earned money, which is completely perverse. But, if the government wants to talk about costs, the real costs are poor policy that has made it so that we've had on the economic front, basically a lost decade. That means I am, well, I guess I'm a bit young, but someone who's been working for the last decade is just as rich as they were 10 years ago. Whereas in the United States, we see, I think the figure in the last decade, you could probably correct me if I'm wrong, is over 15% growth over the last decade, whereas we've stayed stagnant. So I'd love to discuss those costs if they're interested.
No, I think you're providing some much needed perspective here, not only in cutting through some of the spin that politicians put on things and how they use words to describe it as if, hey, we're doing you this huge favor, taking this money from you. Yeah. How many of them are actually serious, though, about reducing the tax burden faced by Canadian citizens? I mean, it's easy to make promises, but are any of them backing them up with some kind of action?
Well, what the government won't take in income, the government will take somewhere else. So especially with, the Liberal government, they have announced, and it doesn't seem as though they'll back off on the very modest income tax bracket decrease. However, another issue that was kind of, that took center stage before the Trump's trade war was a carbon tax. So the federal government has levied a carbon tax across the country for provinces that didn't already have their own form of carbon pricing, and obviously, people were very unhappy with it. They saw it as a consumer, carbon tax. They were seeing it when they went to the pump. They saw it on their electricity bills. And so the Conservatives really came out on top because they really pushed, that they were going to axe the tax, as Pierre Poilievre would have said. When Carney became leader, he decided that, this is like woefully unpopular. So he rescinded the Liberal carbon tax, took credit for it, even though the Liberals put it in place to begin with. But then kind of announced that even though the consumer-based carbon tax would be removed, that he would institute a business one. And as we know, taxes are taxes are taxes. What will happen is consumers will end up paying for that at the end of the day.
And of course, taxes are only one part of the equation. Let's talk a little bit about spending. Do Canadian politicians have the same lack of control as so many American politicians seem to have?
Oh, do they? I know you guys are in the trenches when it comes to federal spending, but I mean, so are we. The government is running. The deficit last fiscal year was about $69 billion. To put it in American terms, just kind of add a zero, right? Since we're about 1/10 of the population of America. And the interesting thing too, is that Mark Carney is, he's promising to balance the operational budget of government. So now he's kind of doing this interesting thing. It's a political sleight of hand, and I hope that, no one pages, your government. He's splitting the capital spending from the operational spending. And he's saying so the operational would be just simply running government. Capital spending would be everything they spend on infrastructure. And they're saying, we're going to balance this one, but not the other one. And so this is kind of a political sleight of hand, because he will eventually say, well, we've curbed the deficit. But, both of them together is what Canadians are on the hook for at the end of the day.
So what we've got about a minute or so left here, but what is the prospect for Canadians? Does this animate the voting public? I mean, I know they have a little ways to go till the next election, but does this animate people to push for greater changes in both spending and taxation?
I'm afraid not. Spending and deficit spending hasn't been top of mind for Canadian voters for some time, which probably explains why we're on our, I think, fourth Liberal mandate. So unfortunately not. But what we see with the upheaval over the consumer carbon tax is that when they see it on, when Canadians see it on their bills, that's when they're motivated to act. Okay.
Well, you have provided, I think, some really necessary clarification. First of all, in talking about the costs and the rhetorical sleight of hand that goes on when it comes to taking taxes from people. I wish you the very best, Samantha. Again, we're talking with Samantha Dagres. She is communications manager at the Montreal Economic Institute and a Young Voices contributor. And Samantha, for people who want to follow you on social media, what's the best way to go about that?
Follow me on X. My handle is Sam_Dagres. And if you're interested in the work we do at the Montreal Economic Institute, you can check out our website, which is iedm.org.
Fantastic. Well, again, best of luck moving forward, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Thanks so much, Brian.
we are back. This is Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to welcome William Barclay back to the program. William, you've been on here a lot of times before, but for those who are meeting you for the first time, take a moment. Tell us who you are and what you do.
Hey, Mr. Hyde, thank you so much for having me back with you today. It's always a pleasure. My name is William Barclay. I'm a political theorist and policy expert, as well as a recent graduate of the Young Voices Contributor Program.
Well, and you've got a really timely topic here concerning France. And I'll admit, I've been paying attention to the news headlines the last few days, and these no-go zones in France, and just basically the streets of France in some of those cities, it's looking more and more like a battlefield. What exactly is taking place there?
Well, I think that in France, what we've had is over the past decade, maybe even decade plus, we've had France adopt these hyper-liberal migration policies that have very much allowed extremists and terrorists and illicit migrants very much from the Middle East and North Africa to flood into France and to very much destabilize the nation and to inject it with their own particular breed of anarchy and extremism. Wow.
Okay, so but there's something to do with the way the officials in France have responded to this. I mean, I flew through France about 5 years ago, and granted, I was just kind of passing through, catching a connected flight, but it's such an amazing country. Paris is such a beautiful city. It's hard to believe that this is the scene of so much unrest. Talk to me about migration and some of the decisions that have been made, maybe not just in France, but in a number of European countries. Who's making these decisions, and why are they reaping what they're reaping right now?
Well, I think there's been very much an effort to kind of endeavor towards pluralism, right? Which is very much a noble endeavor, right? The pluralistic ideal is very much one of the foundations of any liberal or democratic state. But kind of herein lies the problem where we're accepting people in these European states who have no desire at all to adhere to or endeavor towards this democratic or liberal ideal. They very much desire to reject it and to implode any liberal democratic state that they inhabit. I think that, like you yourself mentioned, it's not just France. In Germany, the UK, various European states, there's been very much an effort to rehome and rehouse anybody who manages to make their way across the border, regardless of their effect on society. And it simply destabilized the overwhelming majority of all European states throughout the modern era. I think in Paris, 77% of rapes are committed by migrants and criminals from the Middle East and North Africa. I think there's a specific nation, but it escapes me at the moment. And the unfortunate thing too is that children too suffered. Like they've been raped and subjected to all kinds of sex crime. I think 70% of all violent robberies in Paris and 75% of thefts have been attributed to migrants from the Middle East and North Africa, despite the fact that they only make up only 15 to 20% of the population. And so you've very much seen a rejection altogether of law and order in France and other European nations by these migrants who've been allowed to enter into the state without any real oversight.
So when we mention no-go zones, what exactly does that phrase purport to describe?
Well, so quite frankly, it's an area within France, within many French cities, where police and emergency services, the state itself, is simply unable to enter. Islamic organizations and terrorist organizations such as Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, ISIS, have successfully erected these enclaves within various French cities, where they simply deny entry to French police officers and emergency services. I think it's even France's General Directorate for Internal Security has acknowledged that over 150 districts are now in possession of the Islamists. And Alain Chouet, the former chief of France's security service, has warned that enclaves exist in 859 cities across France and are home to approximately 4 million people, which is roughly 6% of France's total population. And the unfortunate thing is, if you were to go and look up no-go zones right now, are no-go zones real? One of the first answers that would pop up on Google is no, they're not, right? And here you have members of the French police service, the head of various police unions saying, yes, they are real, and we're actually unable to access these areas of our cities. We've been driven out, and we have a state of emergency that's going to boil over into outright anarchy if we're not offered any support.
Well, and it's so interesting that, for instance, Google would say, forget about it. It's really not something that's going on. It's kind of reminiscent of, I think, in the UK right now, people who call attention to some of the problems that you have just described here, they're the ones in danger of going to prison for creating some kind of public offense, as opposed to pointing out, hey, what these gangs are doing, or that's a gang over there that's committing crime. That's the forbidden act, is to identify something that is not supposed to be identified.
No, I agree with you 100%. I think almost you could say post 9/11, it's become almost verboten to criticize Islam in any way, shape, or form, or to say that there's something inherently wrong with Islamic extremism, even, or to kind of say that there's something, let's say, wrong with introducing extremism or terrorists into a democratic society, despite the fact that they endeavor very much to implode it. I think, like you're saying, the criticism of things that are let's say mainstream or democratic nowadays has become almost unforgivable, and we've been forced to almost adopt this romantic viewpoint that whoever has been labeled as oppressed is altogether and always right.
So tell me this: the little enclaves. I understand, and look, even in, for instance, small town America, you'll find neighborhoods that, for instance, if there were a bunch of Venezuelan immigrants who come to a particular neighborhood, they tend to like to be together. And it's not to the exclusion of everybody else, but, we have Chinatown in San Francisco and New York and so forth. I'm just saying you can find that even at the micro level, down to local little towns and cities. But what about political representation? These groups that set up these no-go zones or these enclaves where others are not allowed, they're obviously negating the power of the state there, but are they creating political power of their own, or basically their own system?
Oh, for sure. I think that they've definitely, in many of these no-go zones, they've successfully established Sharia law, and the laws of the state are simply unable to access these enclaves. I think the other thing is, like you brought up Chinatown and say Little Italy and all these various ethnic kind of strongholds, right? Despite the fact that they are themselves strongholds, like we're saying, of ethnicities and various races, these strongholds, the people have not at all rejected the foundational liberal democratic ideology that underlies and predicates any democratic state. Whereas within these Islamic enclaves, that's their explicit purpose, to reject and very much undermine, act as a bastion of attack against the liberal democratic state that surrounds them, those values and norms that they themselves have said are contradictory to their own Islamic ideology and need to be excised from any state that they inhabit. I think one of the problems we've seen many times is that, as you yourself have referenced, there's this tendency against free speech that seems to creep into any Islamic fundamentalist ideology.
So what choices does that leave France? I mean, if you have a parallel society, on the one hand, some people say, well, maybe the two societies can coexist. It doesn't seem like that's very likely in this case.
No, I think that whenever you have two inherently contradictory ideologies that are forced to inhabit the same social confines, they're inevitably going to be forced into conflict, right? And one of them will eventually will out. I think you have various political theorists like Machiavelli and Montesquieu who discuss this specifically. Even Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, has been forced to publicly acknowledge the scale of the problem and admit that if they look at France and Paris and crime in Paris today, at least half of the crime comes from people who are foreigners. So even the most liberal politicians in France have been forced to admit that this is now a problem that needs to be addressed, and they very much need to start instituting more restrictive migration policies and starting to excise some of this, I'd say, Islamic blight or extremism from French society.
Well, and that's, I'm glad you said it, because it sounds like, talking about immigration policies, I know, is fraught with danger. That's like the third rail. Nobody touch that, because you'll be accused of being, xenophobic or something. But what would we got just about a minute left here, William? What would be a meaningful step the French government could take to start to walk this back to normalcy?
Well, I think first and foremost, they need to retake cities like France from the extremists, and they need to start going into these Islamic enclaves and shutting them down. I think that as soon as they're able to retake their first district from the Islamists, it'll be a major win and something that hasn't happened in France for over a decade. I think that's very much the turning point, and we have to see this desire, this intent, and an earnest endeavor from the French state to reinstitute national security and the rule of law and very much democratic values throughout the French state.
Again, we are talking with William Barclay. And William, I appreciate you shedding some light on this. I know this is one of those subjects that even I feel like I kind of have to tiptoe around. I don't want to misstep, but thanks for the clarity that you're offering. Where can people find you on social media? How can they follow your work?
You guys can find me on Twitter, X, at Will Barclay, BBC. And by all means, please feel free to reach out to me there. Reach out to people at Young Voices if you'd like. And I'd love to talk to you guys. I love interacting with everyone. And see you then.
Looking forward to our next conversation. Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. We are happy to welcome Thomas Blakely to the program. Thomas, I believe this is your first time joining us. Take a moment, if you would. Tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Sure, Brian, and thanks for inviting me on. So I'm a lawyer. I'm a federal judicial law clerk. Before that, I worked at a large Wall Street law firm, perhaps of the sort that we're here to talk about today. Before that, I served in the Department of Justice, worked in the state legislature. I do want to note quickly that obviously my opinions are my opinions alone and don't reflect the views of my judge or the judiciary, and nothing that we're talking about is before the court or really ever would be. But thanks again for having me on, and I'm excited to chat.
All right, so I'm looking at the title to this article you've written for Counterpunch. To defend democracy, we must defend Wall Street law firms? Okay, let's dive right in. When we're talking about defending Wall Street law firms, we're not talking knee-jerk defense, but set the stage for us as to why these Wall Street law firms are kind of coming up in the context of laying off of social or of federal workers, or the cutting of federal funding and so forth. I mean, there's been a lot of cleanup and a lot of things being revealed under the DOGE efforts. But how do Wall Street law firms figure into this whole thing?
Sure. So what's been going on in the last few months during the Trump administration, among many other things, has been this ongoing lawfare between, sort of Wall Street law firms and the administration. There have been executive orders that President Trump has signed that are taking swipes at these firms and sort of like lawfare organizations and names that are affiliated with these firms. In response to this, there has been a lot of, first of all, legal challenges, but also, and I think this is sort of the target of my piece, is like these op-eds and these articles, these LinkedIn posts where you have people at these firms accusing their own firms or others of capitulating to Trump. We're sort of seeing all this very, kind of bloviating, sanctimonious, kind of hot air, you might say, that's been coming out of these firms, where the reason I wanted to write this piece is that a lot of what you're seeing cast these firms as like these citadels of liberty, like these bastions of democracy. And it's just, I think you only have to spend maybe like 5 minutes in one of these places to understand that's not really what's going on with respect to how this is being portrayed. So I wanted to offer another view with all the others that have, sort of been aired out in the last few months.
You point out in your article, and I think this was especially on target, this is an age where almost 40% of Americans don't even have $400 to their name. And nearly 1 in 5 kids in the U.S. don't have enough food to eat. And, we're talking about a very small percentage of Americans that actually own the vast majority of the stock market. So there's a bit of a disconnect here. I think for the average person versus those who actually work within those, high-powered environments.
Yes. No, yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're spot on. I mean, we're obviously living at a time where the things that most Americans are concerned about and the areas where you could see failures of the rule of law really come from a lot of the things you just named. And when you're opening newspapers or you're going on LinkedIn and you're seeing, I don't want to name names, but, very successful, wealthy lawyers at, very rich firms, sitting here and like lecturing the public about, never since the Enlightenment has there been, it's like, dude, you represent like BlackRock and Northrop Grumman. Like, who are you to be lecturing anyone about anything? And so there's really a lot of, hypocrisy and, I think a lack of credibility and humility that you see when you're listening to these people, wrap themselves in the American flag while simultaneously representing the most insidious corporations on earth, which, of course, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, we believe that everyone's entitled to a defense. We believe in capitalism and so forth. But I think you have to have at least some fleeting semblance of, I think congruity and, credibility when you want to sit here and sort of make some of the arguments that we're seeing in a lot of these pieces that are coming out. I think that was really the point of what I was writing, which, look, I offer no opinion on the executive orders or, I'm sure if you Google this stuff, there's no shortage of analysis that you can find. The reaction to the executive orders, however, I think is incredibly telling. I think this is really, as much as, if not more than anything else, another front in the culture war, right? I mean, you have at these firms, the establishment, the elite class, this idea of like the Boston Brahmin, the revolving door, who we know, I mean, they don't just dislike Trump or disagree with him. They hate this guy, right? I mean, it's not really a secret. It's really like an autoimmune response they have to Trump. I think the great writer and journalist Matt Taibbi some time ago had a piece where, he characterized, sort of Trump's continued, success and viability as an insult to aristocratic America. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing here. the way that people react to Trump when you're seeing LinkedIn posts from corporate attorneys where they're sitting here saying, never since the Magna Carta has there been it's like, you don't need to go back 700 years to figure out what's going on here. It's really not that grandiose. And so I think that I wanted to present a little bit of an alternative, view that I don't think we hear enough about in terms of really where these people stand and how the public relates to what's going on.
Something you bring up in your article too that I thought was really interesting, because I just wasn't aware of this, but I had no idea how big a role top security or top secret security clearances play in basically being your ability to participate in what's going on. I mean, look, the term bedfellows comes to mind when I think about, corporate America and government at that level. But talk to me about these security clearances. And is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Is it being abused?
The role of executive orders is, not executive orders, but security clearances, as you mentioned, is a key part of what's going on here. The executive orders themselves, one of the handful of things that they seek to do is rescind security clearances from lawyers who are at these firms who have them. And you might wonder why they have, like, if you're representing like United Health Group at a big law firm, why do you have a top secret security clearance? Of course, the answer is if you were, serving under one administration, sort of putatively charged with regulating these companies, and then when things change hands, you go to the big law firm for 4 years and you then represent the companies against the government. You make a lot of money doing this. The security clearance is required to have those government roles. And I think there are a lot of people who might not really mind that. I mean, it's kind of seen as like this ticket to this, revolving door of Washington that doesn't really serve any sort of public interest necessarily. And so the security clearance, as I said in the piece, is really the ticket to the dance. And I think the American people, I mean, they might not be able to sit here and explain which firms are aligned with which party and explain to you how budget reconciliation works. But I think people are able to perceive correctly that there's something rotten at the core of all of this, where you have people in Washington, the K Street, et cetera, who are just constantly going back and forth between corporate interest and the public interest. And by rescinding those security clearances, it throws sand into the gears, of a lot of this. And so I think that's been another, sort of pain point at the core of what's been going on.
Okay, we've got a couple of minutes here, but let's make the most of them. What are some of the things, what are some of the positive parts of those executive orders? And then what are the negatives? What are some of the takeaways that we can see? I mean, on the one hand, I was really happy to see what I perceived as, hey, Trump's coming out and he's taking on fraud, corruption, and waste. I've kind of had to walk that back a little bit, especially as Doge efforts seem to be quietly, simmering down. But as far as these heavy duty law firms, do they just want a place at the table and they see that being threatened by the executive orders?
Sure. Well, I think one thing we have to understand is that, the history of this issue didn't start 3 months ago. I mean, lawfare like this has been going on almost as long as the country itself. I mean, whether you want to go back to the 90s and look at, like the Lewinsky thing with some of those firms and conservative groups, all the way back to the late 1800s with, trust busters and so forth. So it's not new. And when people sit here and talk about draining the swamp, you sort of have to ask yourself, what is the swamp? And I think to a lot of people, it's this relationship between corporate power and, our elected officials that is not serving the public interest. And so one way that Trump, I mean, obviously he has some political objectives here in continuing this legacy of lawfare against the firms. He's doing that, but at the same time, you could look at this as saying, wait a minute, why do these firms have so much power? Why is there this revolving door that is representing organized money more so than the will of the public? And so by knocking these firms down a few pegs, taking away security clearances, trying to back that up, I mean, you can see that as an effort to drain the swamp, at least as I would think a lot of Americans understand that term to be defined. The negatives, obviously, this is ugly. So, more lawfare, more litigation that goes on forever is distracting us in a way from things that could be very, important that we could also work on. Again, we are talking with Tom Blakely. He is a Young Voices contributor. Where can people follow you on social media? So I'm on Twitter, or X as it's called. It's just my name, so X/just my name. And then I'm more active on LinkedIn as well. I post all my pieces there and through a lot of other channels affiliated with Young Voices.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. This is our fourth and final segment today. Happy to welcome Oliver Dean back to the program. He's a political commentator with Young Voices UK. And you wear a couple of other hats as well, Oliver. Tell us a little bit about that.
So I'm the president of the LSE Hayek Society, which aims to promote classical liberalism, free market economics on campus, and also a student at LSE studying history and politics.
Well, we got a great subject here today. And I will tell you, I'm not fluent in a lot of the internal politics going on right now in the UK, but you're speaking my language when you talk about how there are elected officials, or Keir Starmer is committed to granting 16 and 17-year-olds the right to vote in elections across the UK, and you are making the case here that they should be broadening the curriculum rather than the franchise, and maybe extending the vote to those younger people may not be the best way to go about promoting good citizenship. Talk to me a little bit about the move to grant 16 and 17-year-olds the right to vote.
Yeah, so in the run-up to the 2024 election, we saw Keir Starmer pledge to give 16 and 17-year-olds the right to vote, and his argument for this was, well, a lot of 16 and 17-year-olds are able to work and pay taxes, and so therefore they should have a right to say where those taxes go. There's also an argument about democracy, about how we need to engage and invite more young people to engage in democracy. And so we've had this Labour government for about a year now, and it was only in the last few months where he recommitted at the annual liaison committee in Parliament to granting 16 and 17-year-olds the right to vote. But there's been a bit of difficulty and a bit of murky water, and we don't necessarily know if he's actually going to follow through at this stage.
What is the reaction of the public? Is there a call for extending that voting franchise to younger voters, or is this something that a politician sees as potentially helpful to his cause?
Well, I think there is the public opinion is quite divided on this. Obviously, younger people who aren't yet eligible to vote, are going to be supportive of this. But when we look at the facts, I mean, you said, is this a politician just looking out for his own cause? And the statistics would support that. We've seen that the younger you are, the more likely you are to vote Labour. And so if by granting 16 and 17-year-olds this right to vote, it's effectively gerrymandering, and he's giving himself, millions more votes, if not hundreds of thousands more votes.
You make the case here that one of the problems with these younger voters, or by extending that voting age to 16 and 17-year-olds, is they lack real-world experience that they can draw upon. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. So when we think about, your average 16 or 17-year-old, they haven't had real-life experiences. Their life has been defined by four walls in a classroom. And so they don't really have the experience that, 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds have in terms of real-world work, in terms of an understanding of real work. And there's actually a risk as well with having their opinions influenced by teachers. We know that teachers obviously lean more to the left and are more prone to voting Labour. And so there's obviously a massive risk when it comes to actually educating students, whether there's going to be biased teaching taking place, which is then going to lean into Labour's electoral strategy.
Now, I say this as the father of a 16-year-old daughter. I tease her sometimes, and I've teased her siblings about, the beautiful thing about being that age is you still know it all. You still know everything. Our parents are pretty dumb at that. And we get a little bit wiser as we get older, as our parents seem to get a little wiser as we get older. But, joking aside, it does seem like it would be a great boon to politicians of a particular party whom the younger people might be willing to vote for. But talk to me about how strengthening the education system would be a better investment of the time and effort to helping these young people exercise that voting franchise when they reach the age to vote.
Yeah, so if the entire problem is that their lives are defined by this classroom and defined by this one particular setting, if we give them the resources within this environment to be able to learn about these things, to understand the political process, to understand the political parties, then we're arming them with the knowledge that is necessary when they reach 18 to then be able to cast their vote in an informed manner. And a lot of the arguments that people on the other side will say is that, well, young people, 16 and 17-year-olds, are able to work, they're able to then pay taxes. But this counts as real world experience. But the statistics tell another story. We know for a fact that only a minority of 16 and 17-year-olds are in some form of employment, whether that be part-time or full-time, compared to over a majority of 18-year-olds. And so there is a clear divide between 16 and 17-year-olds and 18-year-olds in terms of having that real-world experience, in terms of understanding it. And if we educate more young people about the political process, then we're going to be able to shorten that gap and make sure they're ready when they come to the age of 18.
Talk to me about for the average student, we'll just say for that matter, the average citizen of the UK, do they feel a connection to the political process? Or I'll explain something I see here often in America is a kind of a detachment. Well, that's what we have politicians for. I leave that. I don't have to pay attention because they handle all of it. And that's caused not a small amount of trouble for us here. Are the students in the UK more engaged or more likely to be engaged in political thinking and an analysis of what's going on around them?
Well, if we look at the turnout at elections, we see consistently that young people vote less in elections. So the age range of 18 to 24 has the lowest turnout of all ages of voters. And so there's obviously a risk then that even if we grant them the ability to vote, then they're actually not going to engage in the political process whatsoever. And that's why providing them with that education, making sure they're aware of, the benefits that politics brings, how important politics is in everyday lives, will allow them to become more informed. And then that will lead to higher engagement at the ballot box.
One of the things I love that you pointed out was, well, people try to make the case, well, if they're 16 and 17, if they're old enough to work, they're old enough to pay taxes. Therefore, they ought to be able to vote. And, I remember a similar thing, seeing my very first paycheck and going, hey, why is it missing this? As it shows the taxes that were taken out.
Yeah.
But I really did not understand, the importance of all of the other stuff that goes into it. In other words, it was just boiled down to strictly a fiscal kind of impact and less on some of the broader aspects of how politics affects our everyday life.
Yeah. And as I said, the majority of 16 and 17-year-olds aren't in fact in employment. And so if the argument from the other side is that, well, most 16 and 17-year-olds are indeed paying tax, are indeed working, but the statistics tell another story, that we really can't take their argument that seriously.
So the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, he obviously sees this as a plus. I assume that other politicians within the Labour Party would see it likewise, especially if it's more likely those new voters would go their way. How do other political parties feel about this, or other political leaders? Are they speaking out on this issue?
Well, the main opposition party, the Conservatives, are obviously against the issue. And, that's not only because there's the fact of gerrymandering, but there's also a personal reason for doing that, as in, more young people are less likely to vote Conservative. And so it's obviously going to harm their electoral chances as well. But also, rather interestingly, we've seen this challenger party in the United Kingdom, Reform UK, actually be somewhat in support of this. And we're seeing more and more young people actually expressing support for Reform UK. And so one of the reasons why now the situation is a lot more murky is because the Labour Party have realised, well, not all of these voters are actually going to come to us. Some of them might go to our opposition parties. And so they're less likely to support the reform in the first place.
Okay, one final quick question. If, for instance, they do strengthen political education in the schools, is there a danger that whichever party is in power at that time is going to mandate that the curriculum favor them, or teach those young minds that, hey, this is the way you want to go?
Yeah, and there's always going to be that problem. And I think, the parties can avoid that if they make sure that it's actually an independent, if there's independent audits and inquiries into actually establishing, what is going on in the classroom, how these lessons are being taught. And only then can we ensure that there's no bias in the teachings of political understanding in the UK.
I appreciate you shining light on this for us today. Again, we are talking with Oliver Dean. He is a political commentator with Young Voices UK. And you mentioned you also study history and politics at the London School of Economics and Political Science, where you're president of the LSE Hayek Society. Where can people find you and follow you on social media?
You can find me on LinkedIn, you can find me on Twitter, and obviously just on the Young Voices website.
All right. Oliver, great to visit with you once again.
Great to be with you, Brian. Thank you.